Story 1: The Witch of Hollow Creek. In the heart of a dense, forgotten forest lay the abandoned village of Hollow Creek, a place where few dared to venture. Centuries ago, it had been a thriving settlement until Isolde, the village healer, was accused of witchcraft. The townspeople had once trusted her for her knowledge of herbs and potions, but after a series of misfortunes, a failed harvest, a mysterious plague, and strange sightings in the woods, suspicion quickly turned into fear. Isolde was dragged from her home, tied to a stake, and burned alive. But before the flames consumed her, she cursed the village with her dying breath, vowing to return every Halloween to claim the souls of those who had wronged her. Now, only ruins and echoes of the past remained, and Hollow Creek was all but forgotten, known only through whispered tales and local folklore. Despite the warnings, a group of adventurous teenagers, Ava, Liam, Marcus, and Emily, decided to explore the village one fateful Halloween. Armed with flashlights, snacks, and more bravado than sense, they set out in search of thrills and chills, eager to test their courage against the supposed curse. They reached Hollow Creek as the last light of day faded from the sky, casting long shadows over the crumbling buildings. The air was unnaturally cold, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. The group walked cautiously through the village square, their footsteps echoing off the dilapidated stone walls. "Come on, it's just an old ghost story," Liam scoffed, trying to dispel the growing tension. "We'll check out the well, take some photos, and be home before midnight. No witches, no ghosts." But Ava, more sensitive to the eerie atmosphere, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The wine seemed to carry faint whispers, just out of earshot. She stopped in her tracks, glancing nervously at the others. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Hear what?" Marcus asked, shining his flashlight in her direction. "I swear, I heard something, voices, I think," Ava replied, her heart starting to race. "Probably just the wine," Emily said, though she sounded far less certain than before. As they made their way to the old well at the center of the village, Liam spotted something glinting in the moonlight, an ancient, leather-bound book hidden beneath a pile of stones. The book was covered in dust and age-worn, its pages filled with strange symbols and faded ink. "Guys, check this out," Liam called out, holding up the book triumphantly. "This looks like the kind of thing a witch would be left behind." Ava's knees deepened. "Maybe we should leave that alone," she warned. "There's something wrong about this place." But Liam, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "Come on, what's the harm? It's probably just a bunch of nonsense. Let us see what it says." Ignoring Ava's protests, he opened the book and began to read aloud, stumbling over the foreign words. The moment the incantation left his lips, a sharp gust of wind howled through the village, extinguishing their flashlights. The moon, once full and bright, seemed to dim as an unnatural darkness descended over the village. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and from the depths of the well, black smoke began to rise, swirling into the air like a living entity. The smoke twisted and coiled, forming the shape of a woman, a figure cloaked in shadow, with hollow, glowing eyes and a skeletal frame. It was Isolde, her vengeful spirit summoned by the very words that had sealed her fate. "You dare disturb my resting place," the figure hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "You've awakened me, and now you shall pay the price." Panic gripped the group as they tried to flee, but the village seemed to have come alive, twisting into a maze of dead ends and crumbling walls. The ancient streets stretched on endlessly, the buildings looming taller and more menacing as they ran. One by one, Ava's friends were taken. Emily was the first to go, her screams echoing through the night as a shadowy hand reached out from the darkness and pulled her into the void. Marcus vanished next, swallowed by the mist that had begun to rise from the ground. Liam, still clutching the book, tripped over a root, and before Ava could reach him, the spirit of Isolde loomed over him, her hollow eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Please," Liam begged, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to," but before he could finish, Isolde's hand closed around him, and he was dragged into the shadows, his screams quickly silenced. Now alone, Ava ran blindly through the village, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear Isolde's cackling in the wind, growing louder with each passing moment. The village seemed to close in on her, trapping her in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Finally, she reached the edge of the village, her heart pounding in her chest. But just as she thought she had made it to safety, a cold hand rested on her shoulder. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, and found herself face to face with Isolde. The witch's voice was soft, almost gentle, as she whispered, "You cannot escape me, child. The curse is never broken." With a final, chilling scream, Ava was pulled into the darkness, her body disappearing into the mist. The next morning, the ruins of Hollow Creek were silent once more, but those who dared to visit claimed they could still hear the faint sounds of footsteps and whispers in the wind. And every Halloween, the spirits of Isolde and her victims returned, waiting for the next foolhardy souls to wander into their cursed domain. Story 2: The Spirits of Raven's Hollow. The moorland surrounding Raven's Hollow was a bleak and misty place, a patch of cursed earth that few dared to cross. Legend had it that centuries ago, a coven of witches made their home in the village, using their dark magic to control the spirits of the dead. The witches were powerful, feared by the villagers who lived nearby, for they could raise the dead from their graves and command them to do their bidding. For years, the witches ruled Raven's Hollow, until one Halloween night, the villagers banded together and stormed the witches' lair, setting fire to their home and burning the coven alive. As the flames consumed them, the witches cursed the land, swearing that each Halloween, their spirits would rise again, bringing with them the restless dead to haunt the village for all eternity. Generations passed, and the village of Raven's Hollow fell into ruin, its dark past long forgotten by most. But on Halloween, when the moon was high and the mist thick, strange things happened in the moor. People claimed to hear the faint chanting of the witches, and those who ventured too close never returned. It was this tale that drew a group of amateur ghost hunters to Raven's Hollow one fateful Halloween. The group Mia, Jake, Sophie, and Rob were paranormal enthusiasts, eager to capture proof of the supernatural. They had heard the stories of the witches and the haunted village, and despite the warnings from locals, they set out to document their findings. Armed with cameras, recorders, and ghost hunting gadgets, they arrived at Raven's Hollow just as night fell. The village was shrouded in mist, its decaying buildings barely visible through the fog. The wind whispered through the barren trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something foul. "This place is perfect," Jake said, setting up his camera near the crumbling chapel at the village's center. "If we don't find ghosts here, we won't find them anywhere." Mia, the skeptic of the group, rolled her eyes, but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her since they arrived. She had never believed in ghosts or witches, but something about this place felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the mist seemed almost alive, swirling and shifting in unnatural patterns. They began their investigation, wandering through the narrow streets and exploring the ruins of the old houses. At first, everything was quiet, but as the night wore on, strange things started to happen. The temperature dropped sharply, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty streets, though no one else was there. "Did you hear that?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "It's probably just the wind," Mia said, though she wasn't so sure anymore. They moved toward the graveyard behind the chapel, where the witches were said to have been buried. The air grew colder with each step, and the mist thickened, swirling around their feet. As they reached the graves, Jake's camera flickered and died, the batteries drained in an instant. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to shift. The soil churned, and from the earth rose shadowy figures, spirits of the dead, summoned by the witch's curse. Their hollow eyes glowed with an eerie light, and their mouths moved, whispering in a language long forgotten. The group froze in terror as the spirits closed in. Mia felt a cold hand brush against her arm, and when she looked down, an icy burn spread across her skin. The chanting grew louder, and from the fog, 3 ghostly figures emerged, the witches themselves, their spectral forms twisted and grotesque, their eyes burning with malice. "You have trespassed on sacred ground," the witches intoned, their voices harmonizing in a bone-chilling cadence. The air grew dense as their spectral forms glided closer, robes of smoke and shadow billowing around them. The ground beneath the ghost hunters shifted, as if the earth itself rejected their presence. Mia's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time that night, her skepticism wavered. This wasn't a trick of the mind, something truly supernatural had been awakened. The witches' faces were gaunt and twisted, their hollow eyes fixated on the group with ancient malice. Their mouths moved, speaking words that Mia couldn't understand, but she could feel their meaning. The curse, laid down centuries ago, had been invoked, and now the spirits of Raven's Hollow demanded payment for their intrusion. Rob, standing closest to the witches, staggered back, his face pale with terror. We didn't mean to disturb anything. "Will he leave?" he cried out, but the witches paid no heed. One of them raised her bony hand, her long, talon-like fingers curling through the air. Rob froze in place, his body stiffening as if paralyzed by an invisible force. Slowly, his skin began to pale, and wisps of smoke curled from his mouth as if his soul was being drawn from him. His eyes rolled back, and with a final, choked gasp, he collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Sophie screamed, stumbling backward as the mist thickened around them. "We need to get out of here," she shrieked, but the mist had become like a wall, solid and unyielding. No matter where they turned, it closed in tighter, trapping them. Mia's mind raced. There had to be a way to stop this. The legends said the witches controlled the dead, but they were only supposed to rise on Halloween night. Maybe, just maybe, if they could survive until morning, the curse would weaken. But that was hours away, and they were running out of time. Jake fumbled with his camera, trying desperately to capture the unfolding horror, but the screen remained dark. "It's no use," he yelled, his voice tinged with panic. "We're not getting out of here unless we stop them." One of the witches turned her gaze toward Sophie, who was sobbing in the mist. With a single gesture, the witch beckoned, and the spirits, the dead villagers they had once controlled, rose from their graves. Their forms were barely human, shadows of who they had been in life, but their glowing eyes shone with a hunger that sent a jolt of terror through the group. Slowly, they began to move, closing in on Sophie. Mia's instincts kicked in. She rushed toward Sophie, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the encroaching spirits. "We have to stick together," she shouted, though her voice trembled with fear. The spirits pursued them relentlessly, and it was only a matter of time before they were cornered. Jake, realizing that they had no way out, turned his attention to the witches. "There's got to be something we can do," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Mia, you're good with history. Is there any way to break the curse?" Mia's mind raced, trying to recall the details of the legend. The witches were betrayed, burned alive. Their power comes from vengeance. "Maybe if we can find something of theirs, something they lost," she trailed off, unsure if her idea even made sense. Suddenly, her eyes fell on the chapel. It was the only structure still standing amidst the ruins, its door hanging open like a gaping maw. "The witches' relics," she murmured. "They must have had something important in the chapel. It's where they practiced their magic." With no other options, Mia led the others toward the chapel, the spirits in close pursuit. The ground felt like it was pulsing beneath their feet, and the witches' chanting grew louder, more insistent. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with decay, but Mia's gaze was immediately drawn to an altar at the far end, covered in dust and cobwebs. Atop it sat a charred box, its wood blackened by fire. "This must be it," Mia whispered, rushing toward the altar. She hesitated only for a moment before opening the box. Inside was a collection of strange objects, charms, bones, and an ancient, crumbling scroll. But what caught her eye was a small, silver locket, still gleaming despite the centuries. As her fingers closed around the locket, the witches' voices suddenly grew louder, filling the chapel with a deafening roar. The mist outside swirled violently, and the spirits paused, as if uncertain. Mia clutched the locket tightly and shouted, "This is what you lost, isn't it? This is what was taken from you." The witches appeared at the entrance of the chapel, their forms flickering in and out of the shadows. The one who had summoned Rob's death raised her hand, but there was a hesitation now, a faltering in their spectral rage. Mia could feel the power of the locket pulsing in her hand. "We return this to you," she cried, her voice strong despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You've had your revenge. Now, let us go." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The witches stood still, their hollow eyes fixed on the locket. Then, slowly, the lad witch, the tallest, her face half hidden beneath a hood of shadows, reached out. Her bony fingers closed around the locket, and as she did, the mist began to recede. The spirits that had surrounded the chapel dissipated, fading back into the graves from which they had risen. The witches' forms shimmered, their features softening as they cradled the locket. With a final, eerie sigh, they vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but silence. Mia, Jake, and Sophie stood in the chapel, their hearts pounding. They were alive, but the terror of Raven's Hollow would never leave them. The curse had been lifted, but the memory of what had happened there, the lives lost, would haunt them forever. As the first light of dawn broke through the mist, the three survivors made their way out of the cursed village, vowing never to return. But as they walked away, they knew that Raven's Hollow would remain, waiting for the next unwary souls to awaken the restless dead once more. Story 3: The Harvest Moon's Curse. In the sleepy town of Blackwood, Halloween was always a time of celebration. Decorations festooned every house, children dressed in elaborate costumes, and the harvest festival drew people from miles around. But despite the festivities, there was one place in Blackwood that everyone avoided: the Bellamy Farm. Overgrown and decaying, it sat at the edge of town, surrounded by fields of dead corn and gnarled trees. No one had lived there for years, not since the Bellamy family mysteriously vanished one Halloween night decades ago. The townspeople whispered about the Bellamys, especially old Eliza Bellamy, who had been accused of witchcraft before her disappearance. According to legend, she practiced dark magic and cursed the land in her final moments. Since then, it was said that every year when the harvest moon rose on Halloween night, strange things happened on the farm. The crops, though withered, would seem to come alive, and the spirits of the Bellamy family could be seen wandering the fields, searching for something or someone. That Halloween, for friends Lily, her brother Daniel, and their two friends Clara and Ben decided to prove that the stories were just that, stories. They were skeptics, tired of the superstitions that haunted the town as past. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of reckless bravado, they ventured out to the Bellamy Farm under the full harvest moon, eager for a thrill. As they approached the farm, the air grew unnaturally cold, and the once distant fog now seemed to wrap around them, thickening with every step. The dilapidated farmhouse loomed ahead, its windows like hollow eyes staring out at the night. The cornfields that stretched behind it were lifeless, the stalks brittle and dry, yet as the wind rustled through them, they almost seemed to whisper. Creepy, but it's just an old farm, Ben said with a nervous laugh. Nothing to worry about. But Lily wasn't so sure. She had grown up hearing the stories of Eliza Bellamy, how the townsfolk had blamed her for failed crops, sick cattle, and even the disappearance of children. They had accused her of consorting with spirits, and when her family vanished, some said she had called on dark forces to take them away. The chill in the air seemed to press down on her, and she could feel eyes watching them from the shadows. Daniel, ever the fearless leader, pushed open the rusted gate leading to the farmhouse. "Let us check inside. Maybe we'll find some old records or clues about what really happened here." Reluctantly, the others followed. The house groaned under the weight of years of neglect, its wooden floors creaking with each step. Dust hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Old portraits lined the walls, their subjects' faces faded and grim. But there was one thing that struck them all as strange. The house, though abandoned, seemed lived in. The furniture, though covered in dust, was intact. The fireplace was filled with old ashes, as though a fire had burned there not too long ago. They split up to explore. Clara found herself drawn to an old journal sitting on a table in the parlor. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words were legible enough to read. "The harvest moon approaches, and we are ready. Eliza says we must prepare the offerings if we are to survive the night." Before Clara could read further, a sudden crash echoed through the house. She jumped, her heart racing. It came from the kitchen where Daniel had gone. "Daniel," she called, rushing toward the noise. The others followed, their flashlights flickering in the oppressive darkness. They found Daniel standing in the kitchen, staring at the back door. It had slammed shut on its own. "I didn't touch it," he said, his voice uneasy. "It just closed." Lily's flashlight flickered, then went out completely. "Guys, something's wrong. I think we should leave." But Ben, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "It's just the wind. Or maybe the house is settling. Dante freaked out. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound outside, like footsteps in the dry cornfields. They turned toward the window and saw shadows moving between the dead stalks. Dark figures, their shapes barely visible in the moonlight, walking slowly, methodically. "Who the hell is that?" Daniel whispered, his bravado slipping. Without thinking, Clara pulled the old journal from her pocket and flipped through its pages, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. "It says here the Bellamys made an offering to the harvest moon. They used blood," she said, her voice trembling. "They believed the spirits would take their crops and spare them." Ben laughed nervously. "You kidding, right?" But Lily's face was pale. "What if that's what happened to them? They didn't make the offering, and the spirits took them instead." As they stood there, the shadows outside drew closer, the rustling growing louder. Suddenly, the front door swung open with a loud creak. The air inside the house turned frigid, and the friends could hear faint whispers all around them. The shadows were no longer outside, they were inside the house, circling them. The friends backed away from the door, their flashlights flickering wildly. Daniel turned to run, but the floorboards beneath him gave way, and he fell into a dark, yawning pit that hadn't been there moments before. "Daniel!" Lily screamed, rushing to the edge of the hole, but all she could see was darkness below. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. The shadows took shape, figures with hollow eyes and twisted faces. The Bellamy family had returned, their spirits drawn by the harvest moon, just as the legend said. Clara stumbled back, clutching the journal. "We have to make an offering," she said desperately. "That's the only way to stop them." But it was too late. The spirits closed in, their hands outstretched. One by one, the friends felt icy fingers grasping at their skin, pulling them into the shadows. Ben tried to run, but his body froze in place, his eyes wide with terror as the spirits surrounded him. Lily, trembling, clutched her brother's hand from the edge of the pit, but Daniel's grip was weakening. "Dante, let go," she cried, but she could feel him slipping. As the shadows engulfed them, Clara, in a final act of desperation, slashed her palm with a shard of glass from a broken window and let her blood drip onto the floor. "Take this," she screamed. "It's an offering." For a brief moment, the spirits paused. The air grew still, but then, as if mocking her, they surged forward again, their hunger insatiable. Lily's hand slipped from Daniel's, and he vanished into the darkness below. The others were dragged into the shadows one by one, their screams lost to the howling wind. By dawn, the farm was silent once again, the shadows retreating into the cornfields. The farmhouse stood empty, as it had for decades, waiting for the next harvest moon to rise. And in Blackwood, the legend of the Bellamy farm grew darker. Every Halloween, the harvest moon rose, and the spirits of the Bellamys wandered their cursed land, waiting for new souls to claim their vengeance eternal.